I don't want to grow up, I'm a curious kid. The world has 100 questions I can play.
Thank you, and welcome to Thinking About the Possible, Imagination and Learning in Childhood. This is a Wonderfest event, and my name is Tucker Hyatt, founding director of Wonderfest, the San Francisco Bay Area beacon of science. Our speaker is Dr. Caren Walker, assistant professor of psychology at UC San Diego, where she directs the Early Learning and Cognition Laboratory. Caren earned her bachelor degrees in psychology and philosophy from Boston University, and then a master's degree in psychology from Boston College, and ultimately her PhD in psychology from UC Berkeley. Go Bears. Dr. Walker has published over 40 peer-reviewed works. She has been featured in media pieces by NPR, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. And she has earned 14 awards and fellowships that include a UCSD Outstanding Professor Award, the Rising Star Award of the Association for Psychological Science, and from now through 2023, she has been named a Jacobs Foundation Research Fellow, quite an accomplishment. And I must admit that before all of this, Caren was a Wonderfest Science Envoy. No doubt that's the highlight of her career. Please welcome celebrated developmental psychologist and celebrated Wonderfest Science Envoy, Dr. Caren Walker.
Thank you, Tucker. That was very nice. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. I guess having a talk during dinner might not be the optimal time. I understand. So you're welcome to eat while I speak to you. I'm a very informal person, even with large crowds, so please feel free to interrupt if you have any questions. I'm happy to stop along the way. So I already got this lovely introduction. Thank you so much, particularly to Tucker, for inviting me to speak with you guys today. As he pointed out before I joined the department at UCSD, I was the inaugural class of the Science Envoys for Wonderfest. And I was joking with Tucker that sometimes it was painful to learn how to speak publicly and talk about science in a way that hopefully appeals to the general public. I'm not sure that I've entirely mastered the art, but I have found some workarounds, which is basically to show videos of cute kids when possible, which I can do, and also talk about stuff that's intuitively interesting to everybody, which is the imagination, right? So today I'm going to be cheating. I'm going to be telling you about, I think, one of the most loved topics that we cover in my lab, which is how children think about possibility, and specifically the role of imagination in early learning. All right, let's see if I have control of my slides here. Okay. Imagination is absolutely central to human cognition. In fact, it's been suggested that humans occupy two worlds at once. There's the real world, which is what actually happened in the past and what's happening right now. And while we certainly think about this world, we also spend an enormous amount of time considering many other possible worlds, which is what philosophers and psychologists call counterfactuals, which is all of the ways that the world could have been, but weren't, and all the ways that the world could be, but aren't. And not only is counterfactual thinking pervasive in our everyday thought, you might be doing it right now as we speak, but engaging with these imagined possibilities really deeply affects us. It affects our decision-making, it affects our judgments, it affects our emotions. And, from an evolutionary perspective, this initially seems a little bit surprising, right? While it's sort of obvious that deeply engaging in this way and being deeply affected by the real world should give you some sort of evolutionary edge, it's much less obvious what it is that we get from engaging so profoundly in these ways with what's just purely imaginary. And this seems particularly paradoxical when you consider just the huge proportion of time that children are engaging with these imaginary worlds. Children begin to spontaneously produce symbolic play behaviors like substituting a computer mouse for a telephone, like this child is doing around 18 months. And there's even evidence that they could comprehend pretend sequences presented by an adult even earlier, as early as 15 months. And really, as soon as babies can talk, they immediately begin to talk about not just what's real, but also what's possible. So this is a video taken by a fellow imagination researcher, Dina Weisberg, of her son playing in the kitchen. So for those of you who haven't seen young children pretend in a while, let's just watch just a few seconds of this video. Let me know with a thumbs up, Tucker, if you can hear it.
Almost done. Almost done. Almost done.
What's almost done, sweetheart? What are you making?
Pasta. Almost done. Pasta.
What kind of pasta are you making?
Pasta.
Pesto?
Yeah.
What's pesto made out of?
Basil.
Basil. And what color is it?
Green. Oh, sweet. Also green.
What else are you making for dinner?
Dinner.
Of course.
Soft.
Soft? What's soft?
Pasta.
Pasta.
So we could watch him all day, right? But we're going to come back to him in a little bit. But why would young children, right, who have so much to learn about how the world actually works, spend so much of their time and resources, not to mention the resources of their caregivers, engaging in this way with unreality? So classically, psychologists, including the father of developmental psychology, Jean Piaget here, and our friend Sigmund Freud, who shows up in all sorts of places, probably places he doesn't belong, offered some pretty uncharitable characterizations of pretend play. They basically attributed its prevalence in childhood to children's inability to tell the difference between what's real and what's fantasy. They had sort of slightly different variations on this complaint. But decades of research have shown that, to the contrary, children are actually quite proficient at distinguishing between what's real objects, real people, real events, with those that are only imaginary. So this is just one example of a study from Jackie Woolley, who's at UT Austin, demonstrating this from quite a while ago. She basically brought children into the lab and sat them down. These are 2-year-olds. And there were 3 boxes on the table. And in this study, the experimenter would put a real object like a pencil in box 1, and then would leave box 2 empty. And then in box 3, that would also be empty, but the child was sort of invited to imagine that something real was inside, so the same object, a pencil. And so when you do this with 2-year-olds and you say, can you pretend that there's a pencil inside of box 3? And you say, is there a pencil in box 3? They have no trouble doing this, right? They'll say yes, because they know what to do when you're engaging in pretend. Critically, though, if somebody else comes into the room who was not participating in this pretend sequence and asks the child for a pencil, what the child does not do is go into box 3 and hand them the imaginary pencil, right? They know very well that what they should do is reach into box 1 to be helpful to this person who's seeking this object, right? So this is a simple study, but this ability to adopt this counterfactual premise, like there's a pencil inside of this empty cup, and then to make inferences about events that would follow if this imagined reality were true, like answering yes when I'm asked if there's a pencil in the cup, but also, right, to keep these alternatives clearly separated or decoupled from their knowledge of the real world. All of this is already in place very early on, as early as 2 years of age. Now, some critics of these accounts have historically pointed to the fact that children's emotional reactions to make-believe really do seem real. So children get genuinely afraid of the dark. They get genuinely afraid of the monster right in their closet. So this has been pointed out as sort of questioning this point that children can easily tell the difference between these things. And in fact, there's a bunch of studies that demonstrate that kids do react differently when there's emotional content involved. So for example, in this study from Paul Harris, who's at Harvard, the child comes into the room and there's these 2 boxes, and the experimenter tells the child to pretend that one box contains a happy puppy and one box contains this mean monster. And then they confirm that children do not actually believe that the boxes contained anything, doing the kinds of tests that I showed you earlier. But when the experimenter left the room, what they did was they measured children's tendency to approach each box, and they wound up finding big differences. So the finding is that kids basically avoid the monster box, right? They stay far away from it. This happens even if the boxes are transparent, just to make sure that the children understand that there's not actually anything inside. And interestingly, when you compare across ages, this tendency to avoid the monster box increases over time. So actually older children are the ones that are more likely to sort of engage in this avoidance behavior of this sort of emotionally kind of scary pretend content. And so, right, the point here is that even though children can tell the difference between pretend play and reality, they can also still have an emotional reaction that feels quite real, right? And this, of course, shouldn't surprise any of you because this happens in adults too, right? So this slide works better in person because someone always yells when they see it up on the screen, but hopefully one of you out there jumped a little bit, right? So thank you, Tucker. So the idea is, right, that fictional entities can arouse this emotion system at any point in the life cycle, right? Even though I know very well that this clown is not real, it's just pretend, I can still respond, right, using my emotion system, and so can young children. And sort of more generally, there's this whole variety of other prominent features of imaginative play that suggest that it must be the result of a cognitive competence as opposed to some early limitation. So just to name a few, it's largely unique to humans. It's often social in nature, like a lot of our more complex kinds of cognitive functions. It also becomes increasingly elaborate over time, right? So you would sort of expect the opposite if this was the result of a cognitive limitation. So for example, while young children do the kind of object substitution that you saw in the video, sort of using puzzle pieces to stand in for pasta, once they get older, they don't even need objects to be present in order to pretend about them. They can just sort of generate the objects in imaginary space. And even later, children may develop an imaginary friend, which is this character with a rich and consistent psychology that they engage with over time. And even later in middle childhood and adolescence, some children will develop these paracosms, which are these tiny worlds that they design themselves or with other kids, and they're populated by different types of characters and architectures and economies and laws, right? And of course, this is also continuous over the lifespan. So adults spend very large portions of their lives engaged with fictional worlds, right? Every time we turn on Netflix, for example, or go to a movie or a play, right, we're also engaging in this way. So given that very young children engage with these worlds and that their engagement does not seem to stem from their confusion about the relationship between pretense and reality, we still have to answer the question of why they're doing it and how this is happening. So to answer this question, I'm going to take a little detour away from pretend for a bit to think more broadly about what's going on in childhood in order to try to explain how this period of childhood itself might have co-evolved with our powerful capacity for learning that's really unique to humans. So one of the most distinctive features, biological features of human beings is our unusually long period of immaturity. And when we compare humans with our closest primate relatives, we have this dramatically extended childhood and middle childhood and adolescence, right? Sort of continues for a very long time, where we're pretty vulnerable and still dependent on our caregivers in some way. And initially, right, this very prolonged period in which we're essentially useless, right, and always in danger seems like it might be a pretty bad idea from this perspective. But there's good news, which is that if you look across the entire animal kingdom, from mammals to marsupials to birds, all of these different creatures, the longer the period of immaturity. So if you look here at the graph, right, along the x-axis is weaning time. So this is the period of immaturity. The smarter and more flexible the species, which is here on the y-axis. And this is also reflected in bigger and more plastic brains. And I should note that humans are just way off the chart. They wouldn't fit on the slide, right, on either of these dimensions. So my advisor, Alison Gopnik, one of her favorite examples of this is to compare the domestic chicken with the New Caledonian crow. So the chicken matures extremely quickly over just a couple of weeks. And although they have these really strong specific abilities like pecking, and they're really well adjusted to their particular niche, the set of the behaviors that they actually engage in throughout their lives is relatively limited, right? Newborn chickens basically have the same abilities as mature chickens. But now, if you consider the example of the crow here, the crow is this bird with an extremely and sort of uncharacteristically long not childhood, but fledglinghood, right? Around 2 years. And they're really well known for these incredible abilities to use tools. In some cases, they're even more advanced than chimps, right? So this type of evidence suggests that there might be a relationship between this distinctive childhood and our large, flexible brains and our reliance on learning early in life. There's also some evidence that the period of human evolution itself coincided with some environmental changes that were characterized by greater fluctuations in climate over time. So it's been proposed that as humans, our adaptive niche is something like be as flexible as possible. And this is because we can't really predict what the environment is going to be like from one generation to the next, or even within a lifetime, right? We don't necessarily know, depending on the place that we're located. So there seems to be evidence for these differences in flexibility over the course of different developmental periods, with this trade-off between the cognitive abilities that allow organisms to really flexibly learn the structure of some environment that they're in, which we think of as abilities that are really characteristic of children, and then these more adult abilities that allow for this consistent, skilled, goal-directed action on a familiar environment. So to explain this a little more in the language of machine learning, this is known as the trade-off between exploratory learning, or sort of learning about the environment for its own sake, and exploitation learning, which is sort of knowing how to find the right information about the environment in order to achieve a particular goal. So you can think of this in terms of this temperature metaphor, again, borrowing from Alison Gopnik here, as a difference between a hot or high temperature form of learning, where the learner is sort of broadly bouncing around the possibility space, and this colder or low temperature form of learning, where the learner is really sticking to these tried and true solutions when they're engaged in these kinds of problem-solving behaviors. And this exploratory learning has some pretty clear advantages. It really allows the organism to discover what the specific methods are for survival across this wide range of possible physical or social environments. They're sort of checking everything out, right? But it also has some pretty horrible disadvantages, because it means that they're not going to be prepared, like at all, to deal with the particular demands of the environment that they're actually in until after learning has taken place. Right? So we can sort of think of this extended immaturity of childhood as helping to resolve this trade-off, where we have the freedom to engage in this protected period where we can be very exploratory as children. And that it's being able to do that that allows us to exploit this well-tuned knowledge that we've acquired as children for our unique environment when we reach adulthood. So in other words, these different developmental periods seem to be characterized by very different kinds of strategies for learning, where children and adults can be thought to have evolved to specialize in different kinds of activities because they have these different goals. And I think one of the benefits of this model is that we can sort of stop thinking about children as like shitty adults, right? They're not defective grown-ups that are we're just sort of waiting for them to mature into the useful version of themselves. But instead, right, we can think of them as this powerful feature of our learning mechanism as a human animal in the world. This idea also parallels what we know about brain development. So during childhood, there's this overabundance of synapses. This is the connections that exist in your brain between neurons. So you can see here at birth, and then there's this proliferation of all of these connections throughout the brain. This immature brain is super flexible, it's super plastic. And then over time, the excess unused synapses are sort of pruned away, right? The ones that go unused. So we have all this potential, all of these synapses, all of these connections that later get pruned away, which allows for this increased specialization for the connections that are left behind. So this sort of dual process of synaptogenesis, all of these synapses, and then pruning, occurs last in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is really still developing well into late adolescence. And this, of course, is the area that's responsible for what you might think of as our exploitation abilities, right? This is our working memory and our ability to sustain attention, to focus, to inhibit our actions, and all of these things that are sort of characteristic of adults. So before this area is fully developed, children are going to continue to be more exploratory in their behavior. And in fact, children just do engage in a greater amount of exploratory behavior. This usually occurs in the context of play, right? So we know that play is characteristic of young animals across a wide range of species, and that the behaviors that are involved in play are also those that are going to be really important for the adult members of that species. And this is sort of believed, it's believed that this is so that the immature animal can sort of explore and practice a whole bunch of different actions in this sort of low risk environment without any of the pressures of having to stay alive, right? Or achieve a particular goal like finding food. And so it's sort of easy to see how this purely physical form of exploratory play, like play fighting or play hunting or climbing, might translate into these later abilities. But, right, pretend play is sort of by definition decoupled from reality, right? So in order to make this analogy work with physical play, we have to identify the role that this type of reasoning plays in cognition, and in particular, why it would be beneficial to draw conclusions in this way from these false premises, right? Like there's a pencil inside of this empty cup, like children are doing when they're engaging in pretend play. So to try to answer this question, we want to consider how it is that children's minds might be constructed in order to support and encourage their generation of this sort of wide array of alternative possibilities that they consider when they're engaging in play. Okay, so what I'm going to argue here is that the very same abilities that allow human minds to learn so much about the real world and to reason about it is also what allows them to imagine alternatives to that world. And more specifically, that the ability to represent and reason about cause and effect relationships is what underlies our ability to imagine possible worlds. And also potentially, although it's more speculative, the ability to imagine possible worlds might then feed back to facilitate our reasoning about cause and effect relationships in the real world. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to quickly try to unpack the theoretical grounds for this claim. Okay, so by about 5 years of age, children have already developed these complex causal theories in a variety of domains, everything from understanding biological principles to understanding other minds to the nature of these physical forces and properties in the world. And the question that motivates all of my research, but really the project of cognitive development research in general, which is my field, is how it is that young children are able to do this. How are they able to learn these abstract, structured, causal representations of the world so quickly and so well from such little information that's available to them from their senses, right? So where does all of this complex knowledge come from? And this turns out to be a really old question. It's even got a name. It's called the problem of knowledge, which is that we know that children learn a lot very early in life because we see them do it, but we don't know for sure how it is that they do this. And just to give you a famous example from the philosopher Quine, this is an example from learning language to sort of point out how hard that is, but sort of applies to learning in general. I'll walk through this example with you. So let's say you were in a park with a friend who speaks a language that you've never heard before, and suddenly this little creature hops by, and this prompts your friend to point to it and pronounce the word gavagai. So we all have the intuition that what your friend is referring to is a rabbit, right? But the question is, why is it that we have this intuition, right? Because it could mean rabbit, right? But it could also very well mean any number of other things. It could mean, for example, animal, which is the superordinate category, or it could mean some part of the rabbit, like its big ears, or some action that the rabbit is doing, like hopping. Or it could be the bit of the background scene that you see here, like the yellow flowers. Or it could mean something weird, like rabbit before time t and then gorilla after time t, or undetached rabbit parts, or some momentary rabbit stage, or even a temporal cross-section of a four-dimensional space-time extension of a rabbit, right? So the point is we don't know. This is called the poverty of the stimulus argument, which is pointing out that the stimulus in the world is impoverished, right? There's not enough information in the world to give us this intuition that the word means rabbit. And it really illustrates how hard it is for us to learn from the information that's available to us that we're just sort of passively observing from our senses. Now, development and philosophy have pitched a lot of different ideas about how we might go about learning anything at all. And one classic answer from developmental psychology, which is somewhat redundantly named the theory, points to the similarities that exist between children's learning and scientific theory change. So the idea here proposes that children's early theories share structural, functional, and also dynamic similarity to scientific theories. So the structural similarity is that just like scientific theories, children's theories are abstract, they're coherent, they're hierarchically structured, they're causal. The functional similarity is that just like scientific theories, children's theories have a function. They support things like prediction and explanation, and they also inform children's exploration or their actions, which I'll return to in a little bit. And the dynamic similarity is that children, like scientists, are apparently engaged in this process of implicitly formulating hypotheses about how the world works, and then testing and revising them in light of new evidence that they observe. And this frequently happens in play, right? It also happens in other contexts. So the way that they do this is very much like the scientific method. The idea is that they start with some hypothesis about the world, and then they test that hypothesis and they observe the evidence that they receive from the world. And if the evidence is consistent with their hypothesis, then it will strengthen it. And if it's inconsistent with their hypothesis, then they'll have to revise it, right? And they'll have to formulate a new hypothesis, and they'll repeat this process. So if this all sounds unlikely, I have this lovely video that's borrowed from Christine Laguerre's lab at UT Austin. And we use these machines, or machines like this in my lab as well. It's basically just a toy that lights up when certain things are placed on top of it. We call it a blicket detector. The objects are blickets, and the machine is this detector that tells you when you've put a blicket on top. And what you'll see in this video is that the child has just come upon this anomaly. So they think they know how the box works, but then they find some evidence that it doesn't work the way that they think it does. And I just want you to watch what unfolds, keeping in mind this notion that what the child is doing is engaging in a process of scientific exploration or experimentation.
Putting this on the box and this on the box. Look. This makes that light up the box. How about this? That makes the other side. Uh-oh.
So we're sort of trying out different things here.
Nothing. This one's lighting up and this one's not. So that means what's making this light up?
This is a familiar expression to those of us who do science.
I don't know. Oh, it's because this needs to be like this, and this needs to be like that. That's why. Oh, probably the boxes are the wrong way.
And it ends with embarrassment in front of our peers, right? So although these ideas about children's learning have been around for a long time, recently there's been some major advances in our ability to formally describe the processes that might be taking place by integrating this developmental research, these behavioral findings, with some computational theories. Oops. So one of the central ideas in this computational framework is that children's intuitive causal theories can be expressed as a kind of causal map or an abstract picture of how the world works, like this. So for example, sunlight and water cause plants to grow. Forces in contact cause objects to move through space. Desires and beliefs cause somebody to act in a particular way towards a particular goal. And in many ways, these causal maps are analogous to the more familiar kinds of spatial maps that depict the various locations of objects in space in relation to one another, which is a cognitive feature that we share with other species. So this is a pretty familiar image of a rat running through a maze, right? So having one of these kinds of spatial maps is really useful because it allows for this non-egocentric representation of our knowledge. So it doesn't matter if I'm there or not, right? I can still represent the relationships that exist between these objects. And these representations are also flexible, so they can be updated as new information becomes available to us. So this really allows us to construct a variety of possible routes or representations in order to navigate the world. So similarly then, having this kind of causal map provides this structured representation of the causal relationships that exist in the world, or an abstract picture of how one thing is connected to another thing, and it's constantly being updated as new information is learned during childhood. And when we structure our representations in this way, it's really useful because once you know how one thing is causally connected to something else, then this knowledge is going to support this whole range of inferential abilities. You can make predictions, you consider the consequences of possible actions that you might take, and you can act on the world in an effective way to produce some outcome that you might want. Right. So, for example, between the ages of 2 and 4, children are developing a causal theory of other minds. So they understand the relationships between someone's beliefs and their desires and the actions that they take in the world. And having this kind of knowledge allows them to generate explanations for why people behave the way that they do. And it informs their inferences about mental states and guides their social interactions. Right. It's very useful to have this kind of information. So you can sort of think of each causal map that you have as a particular hypothesis or idea about some causal relationship, some causal structure that exists in the world. So if in this example, I notice that the flowers in my window box have begun to wilt, I might entertain several possible causal maps, each of which generate their own pattern of predictions here, right? So it could be that too much sunlight is causing both dry soil and flowers to wilt independently of one another. Or it could be, right, something else, that the sunlight is causing my soil to dry out, and that my dry soil is what's causing my wilted flowers. And depending on whether my causal map that I'm currently holding is accurate, then the predictions that I generate will be accurate, right? But if it's not accurate, then the predictions are going to fail. And maybe this will prompt me to adjust my causal map so that I can better approximate what I think is the true causal structure of the world. So in effect, the very process of learning is really a process of comparing possible worlds to one another and updating them in light of new observations that I get from the world after I act on it, right? So critically, these maps include the means for representing action, which I mentioned before. So if we think about these wilted flowers, here's 2 different possible causal representations. And although they share the same 3 variables, right, they all have sunlight and dry soil and wilted flowers, the differences in their structure lead to really different effects after I act. So for example, right, I could intervene on my dry soil directly by watering my plants. But then depending on which of these 2 causal structures represents the truth, right, the true state of the world, then intervening on the soil is going to have no effect on my wilted flowers in the first model, right, because sunlight directly causes it. But in the second model, if that model is true, then watering my plants should have some impact on my wilted flowers. So critically, these interventions could be real. I could do them. I can go water my flowers. I probably should. Or they can just be these imagined hypothetical interventions. I can sort of plan ahead and think through the consequences of these imagined actions on the world. And the evidence shows that even preschool-age children can make accurate inferences in both of these contexts, in the real world and also when they're just sort of imagining the result of these actions on the world. And so this gives us this extremely powerful tool for planning, right? And for considering the outcome of a whole number of potential actions in advance of doing them. So to do this, again, we just start with a premise that could be untrue, that could be false. And then we just reason about the implications of that premise downstream. And having the capacity, by the way, to link our emotional reactions to the system, like I was mentioning before, allows us not only to design these effective actions, but to also consider how they might make us feel, right? So we can sort of integrate our emotional response when we're simulating these possibilities about the world. So to sort of push the pause button here, right, this all sounds really, really complicated. You might be wondering whether kids can really do this. And so this is a good time then to sort of return to pretend play, right? So in pretend play, we routinely see that children are considering these premises that contradict their own knowledge, right? They ignore the fact that the teacup is empty, and they proceed to wipe up the imagined tea when I flip the cup over, right? And really anytime that children are acting out the outcome of some pretend event, what they're doing is necessarily setting aside their interpretation of what's real, right? Of what's happening right in front of them. And instead they're reasoning about the causal consequences of some pretend premise that's false, right? That they're setting. And in fact, it's really causation, or like our awareness of the causal world, that gives fantasy play like this its logic. So despite the fact that children could, in principle, pretend anything they want to, right? It's pretend after all. They generally don't do this. So research, again, by Paul Harris, has shown that if a child pretends to spill the sugar during their tea party, they're also going to pretend to sweep it up with a broom, because that's what you do, right? And if they pretend to spill the milk, then they're going to opt for a mop or a sponge. So it's precisely this unique blend of knowledge and imagination together that characterizes what children are doing when they're engaging in this kind of pretend play activity. So really in contrast to what Piaget said, who sort of thought that kids engaged in pretend play because they're illogical, this research suggests that children are actually doing something pretty sophisticated, right? Not only does this 2-year-old understand that there's not really pasta in this pot, he can also consider the consequences of a world in which there were pasta, and what he would do, right? He would stir it, he might check it to see when it gets soft. It tastes best when there's pesto on top, right? So he's sort of importing his knowledge of cooking and eating in the real world into this pretend play scenario. So if pretend play just is a form of this kind of counterfactual kind of causal reasoning, and just sort of arises as a product of the way that we think and learn, this causal learning mechanism that we have, then there's sort of 2 broad possibilities about the role that it might play in development, right? So one possibility is that it might be epiphenomenal, right? It could be just a byproduct, a useless byproduct of our causal learning system that doesn't itself contribute in any way to our learning, right? So, or, and this is my preferred hypothesis, right? It could arise initially out of this causal learning system, but then it could be used to sort of feed back to facilitate its development, the development of the system, by prompting the young learner to do this, right? To sort of engage in this imagination of possibilities in these contexts. So just as play hunting or fighting that we see in non-human animals gives them opportunities to practice and perfect those skills, right? And just as exploratory kinds of play in the physical world and in the social world allows children to sort of discover these new cause and effect relationships about the real world, pretend play might give children this chance to practice and perfect this sort of distinctive kind of cognitive operation that's involved in reasoning about possibility. But in order to kind of make this claim, we really need some evidence that engaging in pretend play actually supports this kind of counterfactual or causal reasoning behavior. And unlike like decades of evidence now demonstrating that exploring the physical world supports learning about cause and effect of the physical world, there's just far less evidence that demonstrates that doing this thing, right, this sort of internal exploration of possible worlds that we do in the context of pretend play has any effect on this ability to learn. And part of the reason, I think, or I know why there's such good empirical evidence here about the role of pretend play on causal learning is because it's just super hard to study it in a controlled setting. So Angeline Lillard, who's at the University of Virginia, recently offered this definition of pretend play behavior as being not only very flexible and non-literal, but also as being associated with positive affect. So you have to have fun while you're doing it. That it's generally child-directed, which is pretty critical. And it's supposed to result from the child's own intrinsic motivation, right? So in other words, you can't just bring a child into the lab and tell them to pretend with you. It doesn't work. I've tried it. It's awkward. It doesn't work very well. So what that means is that the vast majority of studies that have been done to date have really been correlational studies, right? So they look at the relationships between children who pretend a lot or a little, and then they observe what other skills they also have, skills that they think might be associated with pretending. And some of these correlational studies are beautiful. So for example, Marjorie Taylor at the University of Oregon has this cool work showing that children who create imaginary companions also tend to show this advanced theory of mind, or this impressive understanding of cause and effect in the psychological and social domain. And just to point out that like these psychological concepts are especially difficult to learn. This is another one of those big philosophical problems. So just like the problem of knowledge, which we talked about before, this one's called the problem of other minds, right? And the problem is that what I actually see when I look at all of you, aside from your little black box on Zoom, the information that I'm getting usually from my senses is what you're like as a physical object, right? I see what you look like, what you sound like, maybe how you move around. But this really has nothing to do with how I perceive you. Almost automatically, right? I perceive you as this complex individual with intentions and goals and desires and beliefs and thoughts, maybe about me, right? And we sort of take this ability for granted, but actually it's a very hard problem to solve. And it's hard because the thing that makes you a social being and not just another physical object in my environment is the fact that you, like me, have a mind, which requires thinking about others' thinking, right? So it's a complicated kind of skill that children learn over the course of early life. To put it into an everyday context, I use this example in my developmental psychology class, and I kind of like it because we can all relate to it, which is that our interactions with other people require that we think about their mental states, right? So the problem is we can't directly see somebody else's intentions. We have to guess. And sometimes we guess wrong, right? So sometimes I see a student waving in my direction, right? And because I teach a lot of students and I might not recognize all of them, I assume that they're waving at me. But then of course I see the person that they, oh, sorry, and I wave back, right? Because I'm friendly. Like that. But then I see the person that they're actually waving to, and I feel a little bit embarrassed, right? And why do I feel embarrassed? Because I've failed, right? I've failed at this ability to read her intentions. I've done something wrong here. And so this is not just a challenge that I have and you have, but it's a developmental challenge, right? Because other people's minds can't be directly observed. This is extremely hard to do. So the fact that engaging with an imaginary friend in early childhood is correlated with the development of this kind of complex understanding, right? It could be because playing with an imaginary friend supports the development of their theory of mind, but it could also be, right, that children that already have really sophisticated theory of mind abilities are also going to be the kids that tend to produce imaginary friends and enjoy playing with them, right? So in other words, we don't really know the causal direction here between pretending and developing these kinds of cognitive skills. So I'm in a not so recent anymore set of experiments, like these are experiments I did in graduate school, with 4 and 5-year-olds. I have been trying, I should write this paper, to demonstrate that pretend play actually plays a role in supporting causal reasoning in children. So I'm just going to explain really quickly one of these studies. There's several of them. So in this study, children are introduced to one of these toys. It has these 2 little pegs on top, and you can put 2 interlocking gears on it. And they're taught that the way that the machine works is that there's a switch on the front. And if you flip the switch, it turns the machine on and the gears spin, okay? And they're also taught that there's different ways that this machine could work. and that the way this machine works is according to this common cause. And they're showing this little diagram that you see down at the bottom there. So basically they're taught that the switch causes the blue gear to spin, and the switch also directly causes the orange gear to spin, right? So they're each independently caused by the switch. So we asked children to demonstrate that they understood how the toy worked by asking them like a series of questions about different actions that you could take on the toy. So to do this, I would lift up the blue gear and I would say, when I flip the switch, what's going to happen to the orange gear? Will it be spinning or not spinning? And if you're following here, the correct answer is spinning, right? Because it's a common cause. So the switch causes both gears to turn. And then I do the same thing with the other one, right? I lift up the orange gear and I say to them, when I flip the switch, will the blue gear be spinning or not spinning? And again, they provide a response. And after I'm certain that children have learned the actual causal structure of the toy, we start the task, the manipulation. So in the pretend trial, children were asked to pretend that the toy worked in a different way, a way other than the way that I just taught them and tested them on. So I produced like a new card depicting these gears again, and I would describe an entirely different causal structure, which in this case is a chain, where the switch causes the blue gear to turn and the blue gear causes the orange gear to turn. And if you remember from my wilted plant example from earlier, right, you know that these two structures have very different outcomes associated with them when you act on them. So now picking up the blue gear, right, since the blue gear causes the orange gear to spin, now when I turn on the switch, the orange gear isn't going to move anymore, right? So it's a different outcome. So I say to them, I ask them to reason about these actions, assuming this pretend structure. I say, let's pretend that my toy works like this, right, this new thing. And I take this gear off and I flip the switch. What will we pretend is happening to the orange gear? Would it be spinning or not spinning? So to clarify, children never actually observed this new thing. They've never seen any evidence of it. They were just asked to reason in the context of this pretend scenario. So then there was a second manipulation, but this one we didn't use any language about pretending. We just sort of pitched it as this kind of dry counterfactual, what we call this hypothetical, where children were again asked to consider what would happen if the toy worked a different way and we changed the structure again, right? And so this time we said, instead of let's pretend or pretend with me, we said, what if my toy worked like this? I took the gear off, I flipped the switch, what would be happening to the orange gear, right? So the same kind of prompt. So children answered 2 questions. And the key manipulation here was that the order of the presentation of the 2 trials, the pretend, either came first or it came second. So we sort of counterbalanced whether pretend happened first or second. So half of the children saw it first, half of the children saw it second. And the idea is that if pretending actually supports their reasoning about this causal system, then pretending first during the first trial should facilitate children's reasoning in the second trial. So this is what we found in the hypothetical question. So this is no pretend. So what happened when they got the hypothetical question first or second? You see along the y-axis here, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but yeah, it's out of 2 because they're asked 2 questions. And the gray bar is when they got the hypothetical first. So they have never pretended with the system before. And the blue bar is what happens when they did pretend already. So they pretended first and now they're being asked a counterfactual question about the toy. Okay. So it looks like at first that maybe pretending is facilitating their ability, but of course it could be due to practice, right? Because this happened second. And so we want to take a look at what happened in the pretend trials. So when you look at the pretend trials, it rules out this practice account because we don't see any differences here. It doesn't matter if they pretended first or second, pretending always did better than this initial sort of hypothetical condition. So what these results tell us is that pretend play in this little toy scenario here, right, does seem to support children's hypothetical causal reasoning abilities about that same causal system. So not only are these skills related to each other, but it seems like something about pretending first helps them to develop this sort of causal or counterfactual reasoning ability when they're asked about it afterwards. Okay, So one final question that you might have is sort of what's so special about pretend? Is it just sort of a linguistic trick, like kids know the word for pretend and that makes it more intuitive? I don't think that that's what's going on. I think the answer is actually that pretend play is just easier to compute for kids. So to better understand why, I think that if you think of, I think it's helpful to think of the pretender as this little god of their pretend world, right? So if you think of the child, all the child has to do is set the premise and then reason forward from there, okay? So there's no reason to reason about any of the things that came before. I might be pretending B, right? And I don't have to worry what caused B or what caused that. I can just sort of set the premise at B, and then all I have to do is reason forward to C in this case, right? So you might have observed children engaged in this kind of negotiation of the terms of the pretend scenario. They sort of all sit around and they like carefully set the premise, right? Like, we're in a doctor's office, I'm the doctor, right? You're the child, this is the parent. They don't have to worry about, you know, where the doctor went to medical school. They don't have to sort of reason backwards about any of the causes that occurred before. They can just sort of set the scene and then move forward. So this is all mere speculation. I don't have any evidence for this, but we do have some studies in progress trying to test these ideas. And the idea is that maybe what pretend is doing is facilitating this reasoning because it allows learners to do this in a sort of simpler and fun, sort of intrinsically motivating way. Okay, so wrapping up. So what I'm going to propose here then is that pretend play is this precocious display of children's developing abilities to engage in this cause and effect reasoning. And also more speculatively, that engaging with these imaginary worlds actually feeds back to serve as an engine of learning for this very same system from which they arised out of. And to sort of summarize the logic of the talk, because I covered a lot of different things here, so let me do this for you in a single slide. The idea is, right, that we have these long periods of protected immaturity where we engaged in this increased exploratory kind of learning, usually in the context of play when we're children. And then engaging in this exploratory play allows for the kind of learning mechanisms that support these causal maps, right? So we can build these abstract representations of the world. And then having those maps, those abstract representations, then supports our reasoning about false premises or counterfactuals, which might initially be expressed in the context of children's pretend play. And then finally, just reasoning about those possibilities in pretend might feed back to support the mechanisms themselves that underlie this entire causal learning system. Okay. So I'm going to leave you with this quote, which also serves as an acknowledgement for my colleague, my advisor, Alison Gopnik, who co-authored all of this work with me in this area. And she said this lovely thing where she said, if past counterfactuals, so like when we're thinking about how things could have gone better, right, are the price that we pay for future counterfactuals, which lets us do all these powerful things like planning, then fictional counterfactuals are the free bonus that we get. So thank you very much. That's all I have for you today.
Dr. Walker, thank you. Caren,
Yeah.
thank you. Oh, I got a note that your advisor, Alison Gopnik, your co-researcher, is this year's winner of Wonderfest's Carl Sagan Prize for Science Popularization. So,
Oh, really?
huzzah for,
Yeah, well
for
deserved.
child development psychologists. All right.
Oh, that's great.
And thank you for your talk. I've got some questions that are eating at me here, but I want to see if our audience, who should get priority, has any questions here. No hand raised yet, but look, there are so few of us. Ah, Stuart in Cupertino. Sometimes Stuart likes to ask his own questions. So Stuart, don't be shy if you want to, you don't need me. What childhood learning steps or stages are involved in the development of critical thinking versus gullibility? And how would they contribute to adults in our world today who are so quick to believe others, who seek to misguide them with fake news or false cures or improbable historic narratives? Oh, Stuart, I see you just on, pardon me, Stuart, your next question comes from you.
Hi, Stuart. Okay, so you're asking me, why are kids good at critical thinking while adults fail so miserably. No, you're asking me sort of what are the stages involved in our ability to sort of think logically about the information that they receive.
Yes, I guess I'm wondering if there's some flaw in a person's childhood developmental stages as they're growing up, which contributed them to being a gullible adult as opposed to an adult with more refined critical thinking skills who can say, no, I don't believe you. You know, I don't believe that this medicine you're trying to sell me is you know, legitimate, or I haven't, whatever, you know, they have the skills to do some basic research and questioning as opposed to just being gullible.
Yeah, right. It's a really good question. Yeah. So like to put it another way, like why do these tiny scientists who are so intuitive and reason scientifically turn into these gullible, fallible, terrible adults, right? I think that it's a great question. I think that there's a lot of responses to this question. One response, right, is that learning can do really wonderful, fantastic things for our ability to reason, and it can also potentially impede reasoning, right? So the more knowledge that you're acquiring from the environment that you have, right, the more prior beliefs that you hold about a particular event, the more likely you are to be biased to sort of privilege this information that's coming in. And sometimes, right, that learning is being influenced by people in your environment or experiences that you've had. And so, you know, in some ways, to sort of refer back to the part of the talk where I was talking about how children tend to be more sort of more flexible and more exploratory than adults. They're sort of more willing to examine initially, maybe less likely to them, hypotheses about how the world works. Whereas as adults, right, we have quite a bit of existing knowledge already. And so we might be more inclined to sort of fall back on or rely on these existing biases that we've gathered reasonably, right, throughout our lives. And so while it's often the case that gathering knowledge helps us, right, and allows us to solve problems in a way that's really beneficial for us and lets us do all these great goal-directed actions that we're good at as adults, it can also get in the way, right, by sort of leading us to believe that something that we already know or believe that we know to be true is actually true. So I think that there's a bit of freedom involved in having less experience and less exposure to these prior ideas. But there's also other work. So there's a scientist named Andrew Stillman who's at Occidental College, which is in Southern California. And he talks a lot about some intuitive beliefs that we hold that tend to be very useful in navigating the world, but also sometimes can get in the way of thinking scientifically about things. So we have these like hacks, these workarounds that have been really sort of evolutionarily useful to reason about the world, that are sort of quick heuristics, right, that we might bring to a particular problem solving scenario, but that sometimes we rely too heavily on these quick biases and we sort of ignore the evidence that's right in front of us. And so it can sometimes lead to what you're describing, which is like an inability or unwillingness to sort of revise our beliefs in light of scientific evidence or something like this. So again, like I think all of these things can be really useful, right? They're like useful workarounds for getting around in the world that sometimes get in the way as we grow up.
Thank you. So it sort of sounds a little bit like that idea that an expert in one field tends to believe his expertise carries over into other fields that he isn't an expert in, that sort of thing?
Yeah, potentially. So I guess we all have this problem a little bit. Yeah. So if I have a whole bunch of knowledge in one area, yeah, I might assume that I also know something in other areas as well, right? So I have the experience of generally knowing what to do, and so maybe that feeds into it as well. Sort of an assumption that I must know the correct answer, and less of a willingness to be sort of open or flexible.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Stuart. Meryl Goudou, a scholar herself, Dr. Goudou, please ask your question.
Hi, Tucker. Hi, Caren. Thank you so much for the talk. I wanted to ask you to speculate about, and I think that you mentioned briefly in passing, this idea that we seem to be attracted about the blend to fictional, it's like Netflix and stories and things like this. And it occurred to me while I was listening to present the last study about the potential benefit of priming a kid with pretending about the machine with the gears on it, to there's also going to be to reason counterfactually. It seems like, I think you have some prior work suggesting that kids learn better from stories. They learn certain things better from a fictional story that more or less closely resembles the real world. And I guess I wondered what you think about, so idea that you might have, right, about the findings of the last study, that just any kind of pretending, sort of loosens us from reality, like sort of makes some kind of distance and allows our imagination to sort of allows us to be less tethered to the real world or something like this, which in some way would make our learning better. And so you might imagine that the pretending thing about the box would be just as strong, like if you pretended that you were Superman or something totally unrelated to the gear toy before doing it. But intuitively, it seems sort of like maybe there's some kind of sweet spot where just similar, where like the parts are just similar enough, or but still a little bit different versus being removed. And I wonder if you can comment on sort of like just maybe you could hypothesize, I guess, what would happen if you say just had a child pretend something totally unrelated to the box before you did it or something, whether there's a kind of Goldilocks sweet spot thing going on about like what it is exactly that you're pretending, and then the scenario that you need to apply in a similar way. Like I think some of your prior work had suggested that there's a kind of spot between how similar a story that you hear is to then your subsequent abilities to reason.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, so this prior work that she's talking about is this study where we show that if you're trying to get children to learn something from a storybook, these storybooks are sort of bizarre, right? Because they kind of interweave fantasy and reality, and we just sort of assume that children are picking up on the things that we want them to learn from these story contexts. And so I have some prior work that shows that actually when stories are more realistic, it facilitates children's ability to learn at least this causal information from stories. So I think that, that work on sort of, it's fiction, but it's realistic fiction, with the goal being to learn some piece of information that's embedded in the story. In those contexts, being really tightly linked to reality can be helpful because you can sort of see how your knowledge might reasonably transfer. Children sort of tag super fantastic stories as being kind of not relevant, right? They enjoy them, but they kind of quarantine the information that they learn in those contexts. So that's what that finding is. So the question here is, what about pretend? Like, does it make more sense? Like, is what you're learning in pretend somehow necessarily tied to the particular content? Some people like Ori Friedman have these theories that that's exactly what you're doing in pretend. You're actually like learning specific content from, for example, other adults or children that you're playing with. I find his findings cool, but I don't really think that's what's going on. I think that in the context of pretend, like the kind of studies that I was talking about here, I would say, right, that just sort of engaging in wild pretense, really anything at all, where you're kind of setting a premise and reasoning about the consequences, should be supportive of sort of engaging in this multiple possibility style of reasoning, right? So like sort of priming you to think in a way that's more flexible or more open. And we have tried to do a pretend play training study. It's called the training study. There's probably folders on Alison's computer called the training study, where we basically try to bring kids in and get them to engage in pretend first for like 20 minutes. And then we give them one of these causal reasoning tasks and see if what we've done is sort of make them more exploratory in the way that they learn, right? Maybe they'll discover more of the hidden features of a toy that we give them, for example. And the problem that we had with this work, even though I still think it should work, is for exactly the thing that I mentioned before, which is that putting kids in the lab and telling them to pretend is hard and it doesn't work. And so I think the only way to do this for real, to sort of prime kids by engaging them in pretend, is to go into a classroom where children are sort of naturally engaging in pretend that's child directed, and like maybe like pull them aside afterwards and see if they're sort of in this more open frame of mind. So yeah, I mean, I guess the answer to your question is that I actually do think there might be a sweet spot when you're learning particular content, like when you're learning how the gear works on this particular machine. But in terms, I think it's also the case that if all you're trying to do is increase flexibility or exploratory thinking, then really engaging in any kind of pretense should do the trick. So we'll see. You should do that study.
Thank you for the question, Marielle. All right. Both of my questions, I will shoot them here, are rather specific and therefore a little embarrassing. But early on in one of your examples, didn't you say that the puppy and monster box scenarios were that even in older children, there was more hesitation approaching the monster box?
Yeah, especially in older children.
Older children though, not let's say in young adults. There was a point
No,
where
yeah, I don't remember the range of ages, but I think the kids ran from like 2 to maybe 5 or 6. I don't remember the specifics, but the idea is that, again, like if it's evidence for some sort of limitation, right, you would always expect development to improve. So if their like link between emotion and response, right, in these pretend worlds is just a sign of immaturity, then the 5-year-olds should be less likely to respond in this way than the 2-year-olds. But actually what you find is that the 5-year-olds are sort of better able to engage in this imagination where their emotions are sort of tapped in to inform their behavior, which, as I noted sort of later, is really useful, right? Because when you're planning for the future, you kind of want to know, like, what is my emotional reaction going to be to a particular interaction or scenario, right? So how can I behave in a way that would bring me desirable outcomes that I feel positively about, right? So I think it makes a lot of sense to develop this ability to appraise with emotions the various actions that you might take.
could the older children also have been incorrectly, perhaps more trusting somehow of the adult, presumably, who told them there was a monster in that box?
Yeah, so we know that capacity to sort of trust in adults also develops over time. Sometimes, right? So to speak to Stuart's question, sometimes this isn't so good because adults tell children things that are false, right? So I think that, yes, children tend to get sort of more trusting of adults as they develop. But in this case, I think there were careful controls to make sure that the children understood that they were just pretending. The experimenters said that they were pretending. There's nothing in the box. They got to see that there was nothing in the box. So I think in this case, the children could report that they understood that there was no real monster there.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the Blicket box experiment with the little boy who I thought was so impressive in trying to rotate the different structures on top of the box and yet couldn't get the light to go on. What I need to know, this is psychological torture of a little kid.
Yeah, the answer, sorry, Tucker, I thought that's where you were going. I should have said, but the answer is two blocks on one and 4 blocks on the other. So it was like one of these rules that you would never get, right? And it was set up that way because what she was studying in that study is children's tendency to spontaneously generate explanations when they explore and they discover this anomaly. And so she made it so that it would be easy to discover one of the rules, but then they would realize that it didn't apply. And so she was really curious what would happen if you had this rule that like you could never get. I think that kid did eventually get the rule after like 15 minutes of play.
Unlike this adult. Yeah.
Well, you weren't playing, you were just watching passively. Totally different learning system.
Oh man, Dr. Walker, let's see. All right, there are no hands up. We've exhausted the chat, but our curiosity is not exhausted. Thank you so much for this. I have 3 big thank yous. The last one I'll say for you. First is thank you to the Zoom audience for being here, the small but mighty Zoom audience. Thank you to Wonderfest supporters. Some of you are here in the crowd. I sure appreciate you. And thank you now, Dr. Walker. Dr. Walker, thank you. Thank you. And good night all. See you again in some Wonderfest venue.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye everyone. Thanks for coming.